So one of the things that we need to understand in understanding Maud Brewster as this kind of perfect feminine figure in this Sea Romance by Jack London is this idea of what we would have called the Victorian ideal. Now, the Victorian ideal, refers to a period of English literature that was dominated by the British in the 19th century. What you need to understand is the Victorian period, which is kind of the glory period of the British Empire. That's when the sun literally never set on the British Empire because there was a piece of its empire literally having the sun shine it all across the globe. It was a period of both outward conformity, meaning people were very much respectable in their outward appearances and how they would conduct themselves in public, but it was called outward conformity and inner lust and desire, right? The Victorian period was a period that was famous as a time of hypocrisy. It was a time when women were exalted, and yet in the streets of London you could buy a 13-year-old girl for a half shilling. That's a famous quote by a British author, by the way. I'm not making that up. So in the Victorian ideal, women were almost non-sexual. Not in the sense that it was considered bad for women to have sexual desires, although it was considered bad for women to have sexual desires of their own. The idea is that anything sexual is carnal and earthly, right? Sexual is carnal and earthly, and somehow that made it beneath women. Women were supposed to be spiritual, right? Filled with light, right? They were supposed to be like angels. They were supposed to be these kind of wispy, willowy, delicate. This was a period of the feminine, which made the feminine allied with the spiritual, and the carnal, the earthly, the sexual. All of this was supposed to be associated with masculinity. So the idea is that men, right, desire, and women are pure, right? That's the idea. The ideal woman is spiritual and pure. And in this case, we can understand then how this quote-unquote ideal woman is being contrasted with this figure of Wolf Larsen, who's an animal and a predator, right? And so this Victorian ideal, right, this idea of woman is this idea of everything about a true woman should be like an angel walking on earth, that women should be almost these like semi-spiritual beings and not necessarily have, they're just always nice and always helpful. And some of these tropes of femininity, quite frankly, are not only unrealistic, but rather destructive. But that is what Maud Brewster is kind of portrayed to be in at least a physical kind of way. The reason why all of these things about, the Victorian period and the idea of the Victorian woman being spiritual and non-sexual and pure and all these other things, the reason why this is actually being viewed as a positive in London's novel is because of this earlier mention of Furuseth, right? Remember the friend Furuseth, and now he has Schopenhauer's, right? There's this philosopher Schopenhauer who had a lot of very negative things to say about women. Schopenhauer, his whole verdict on women was this, that they're beautiful for a while, and that nature tricks men into loving them when they're attractive, when they're young, and then they marry them and have children with them. Then their looks go, because women change with age and pregnancy, and then basically marriage traps men for life to take care of women who Schopenhauer says are annoying, intellectually inferior, and only beautiful for a few years, right? So, as I say, Schopenhauer was, I'm sure, very pleasant to have at dinner conversation. So the reason why this is all mentioned in the context of London is because the whole idea behind the Schopenhauer view of women, which is very, very negative, is that women draw men in by their physical beauty, by their carnalness, by their beauty that fades, by the beauty that they have that is, very much ensnaring the senses, the physical senses, and thus once men give in and have children with them and now have to take care of them and the children, that then tricks them for the rest of their lives. The idea of the Maud Brewster being the Victorian ideal of woman is a positive when it's as a backdrop against these views of Schopenhauer that Jack London has. Because the idea is that it's true that Humphrey loves her for her physical form, but it's because her form matches her soul. I mean, she's basically like a walking soul. The idea of how she's described as being ethereal is that she's a walking idea. It doesn't describe her curves, for example. It doesn't describe her as being voluptuous. It doesn't describe her in terms of any physical attributes, except being in contrast with Wolf Larsen. So the idea is if he loves her for her form that matches her soul, and he also loves her for her essays and poetry, the idea is the love that Humphrey Van Weyden is having for her, in falling in love with her, is basically the opposite of what a normal love would be that would be despised by Schopenhauer, right? In this case, the character of Humphrey Van Weyden has really fallen in love with the person of Maud Brewster, with the soul, with the interior stamp that is also being perfectly expressed in her physicality, right? And that's the idea. And he even says he always hoped to fall in love. He says he guerdoned love, right? Guerdoned means to honor, right? I know it's one of those really old words that we really don't use too much anymore. And so he always honored love as being the highest thing. But for Van Weyden, who was always just, a cold-blooded fish, right? Someone who was more interested in books than real life, called him an analytic monster, right? Is what Furseth called him, right? He had only ever been interested in things of the mind and things of the soul. And in Maud Brewster, this poet, who basically is kind of all mind, he's finally found someone who attracts him, but not in the typical carnal, lustful way, but in a way that actually appeals to his intellectual side, in a way that appeals to his kind of total intellectual bent, as it were. She's a mind, he's a mind. Together, they could be of one mind, right? That's kind of the idea. And so, their love, in that sense, is a love which can be thought of as pure, right? And so, the other question then becomes, so we can understand what Humphrey sees in Maud. What is it that Wolf Larsen sees in Maud? And strangely enough, it's probably the exact same thing. He sees in her a woman who actually has a pretty formidable intellect and fire and moral courage, the heart to stand up with him, although she's been told by Van Weyden that for the time being it's better just to amuse him and not to incur his anger or wrath. One of the things, just to be clear, he invokes when he's thinking about, he mentions the poet Simon, right? Simon is a great English poet, right? And he also mentions, he says, Mrs. Browning, right? He mentions the poetry of Mrs. Browning. And it's likely, right, that he mentions these poets because, of course, Maud Brewster is a poet. This fictional character is a poet. But these are also Simon wrote a lot of great love poetry. And this reference to Mrs. Browning, right, is another idea. It's kind of a foreshadowing of what Humphrey hopes to be with Maud. Because Mrs. Browning, whenever you refer to a poet, you have to refer to either Mr. or Mrs. Browning, because there are two very famous Browning poets, right? There is Robert Browning, that ended up being the husband, right? And then there is Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And the reason why we still use her original surname is because a lot of her great poetry was published under her maiden name Barrett before she married Robert Browning. Interestingly enough, during their marriage, it was Elizabeth who was considered the poet of worth. Unfortunately, she died younger, and then later on, Robert Browning would be the one who would be a poet of acclaim. So the idea of when he refers to Mrs. Browning, because when you're referring to the poet Browning, it could be referring to either one of this husband and wife duo. It seems that Humphrey Van Weyden is kind of hoping to think of himself in comparison to Mr. and Mrs. Browning, two great poetry minds who basically fell in love with the other's soul. They fell in love with each other as writers more than anything else. They actually, and this is the other thing, was because you remember that the alliance that those two have to have against Wolf Larsen is a secret alliance, remember? In order to not arouse his jealousy, right? they are basically saying we need to be allies, but we need to be allies in secret. Although if they think that they're fooling Wolf Larsen with that one, that's probably unlikely, right? But like that, this idea of a secret alliance, Robert Browning and Elizabeth Barrett Browning actually courted, meaning they saw each other in a relationship, intending marriage is what courtship means, right? That they courted secretly as well. So this poetry from Browning, Simon, who would sometimes write poems about secret trysts and secret courtship, and again, this relationship between Browning and Elizabeth Barrett Browning, right, is kind of a romantic nod to the idea of a secret love affair or a secret affair that they are trying to carry out, while in this case, Elizabeth Barrett, who wanted to sort of be rescued from her life, and we also have Humphrey, who wants to rescue her from the fiend that is Wolf Larsen, right? All of that is kind of homages to what this is getting into. One of the things that has to come up, though, so these are all some of the interesting terms that are coming about. But the idea that we need to understand is that, in a certain sense, we have the character of Larsen, who is the perfect primitive man, and he is being contrasted in the opposite being Maud, who is the perfect civilized woman. And in this way, this book is actually going to go against a lot of the common sea novel romances of the time. Normally, in a sea romance, the perfect civilized woman, right, she usually falls in love with the perfect primitive man. And you often see this frequently in romance genres, and we're going to talk about that in the next section.